Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll start if you'll all please take your seats. Thanks so much for coming out on this rather warm day. Here it's a little cooler. I'm Orville Schell, and I'm the Arthur Ross Director here at the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. And tonight's really, it's a wonderful occasion for me. Not only have I been a reader of the New York Review of Books for 50 years, but have written for them. And I have to say that the coverage of China that they have run over the years has really been incredible. And I was just reading a piece in the plane today, another reminder of so many books get written, go unsung, and it's nice to see somebody who actually is still involved in reviewing books in a thoughtful and interesting way. Now, this occasion arose because the Asia Society and our center has formed a partnership with the New York Review to take all of the writing that they've done on China, which is voluminous, by some of the most wonderful people over the decades. And we were launching a new website ourselves called China File, which will cover all aspects of China and the U.S.-China relation, from video to photography, to book reviews, to reports, to news, to social media, art, culture. And we have all of these articles in repose in one archive, available to all of you, and they are searchable. And so it's a nice thing for us to be able to sort of celebrate that partnership and also to celebrate the review. To introduce our evening, I'm pleased to welcome Hugh Eakin, who is the senior editor at the New York Review, and he will talk a little bit about the panel and introduce our panelists. Hugh?
Thank you, Orville. On behalf of the New York Review of Books and our publisher, Ray Hederman, it's a very special occasion to be here tonight for this important discussion about the stability of China and the transfer of power this fall. We'll be hearing from several of the most astute experts thinking and writing about China today, experts whom we at the New York Review have also been lucky enough to have in our pages. Along with our special guests, this group, of course, includes our host, Orville Schell himself, who, as many of you know, has published very widely on China, including for the New York Review of Books. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to make a special mention of the New York Review's editor and co-founder, Robert Silvers, who would have very much liked to have been here this evening, but is on his way to Oslo for another New York Review event. Bob has had an enduring, passionate interest in China over many, many years, and I think this has been reflected in our pages, which, without sounding too grand, I'd like to say have sometimes been an active part of unfolding events in China. And I'll just give one or two examples here to give you an idea of what I mean. I think many of you are familiar with the review. Fang Lizhe, the great physicist and moral voice and dissident who died this spring, had a very long relationship with the New York Review. Characteristically, he became sort of a household name in the United States after Tiananmen Square, but Bob had long before known of him, heard about him, and published a major piece by him in the very first months of 1989. So review readers were already well aware of him at the time he became a kind of world figure. And another more recent example, Charter 08, this courageous document, a democracy document that was penned by Liu Xiaobo and others in the final months of 2008, the review published it in English in real time, more or less as it came out in Chinese. And this document, of course, was one of the reasons that Liu Xiaobo was then charged with subversion, and also cited in his being awarded the Nobel Prize. But more than that, perhaps, is the continual coverage the review has devoted to China in almost every issue. Over the years, the review has sought out the most authoritative thinkers, writers, journalists to write about China and the key and urgent questions it has presented and continues to present to the United States and the world. Which brings me to our guests tonight, Roderick MacFarquhar and Ian Johnson. From very different backgrounds, both of these remarkable writers and thinkers, I think, exemplify the New York Review's particular approach to analyzing and writing about the world. And what I mean, it's what you might call bringing journalistic clarity to deep scholarship and scholarly rigor to long-form journalism. Let me start with Professor MacFarquhar from Harvard University. Having had his own early career in journalism, he went on to found China Quarterly, the leading scholarly journal of its kind. And then, in his own groundbreaking scholarship, established himself as one of our foremost historians of the Chinese Communist Party and the world's leading authority on the Cultural Revolution. And amid all this, after writing the first volume of a definitive 3-volume account of the Cultural Revolution, he somehow found time to be elected to and to serve in the British Parliament. He has contributed to the New York Review of Books since the 1980s, analyzing, I believe, more than one transfer of power in our pages that has taken place in China. His most recent works include Mao's Last Revolution, which he wrote together with Michael Schoenholz, a spectacularly thorough 1-volume account of the Cultural Revolution. And he's just edited a new 3rd edition of The Politics of China, a classic history of the entire sweep of communist rule in China, a standard reference for several generations of students, I think, and I include myself. So let's welcome Professor MacFarquhar. And with him tonight, arrived from Beijing just a few days ago, is our other guest, Ian Johnson. He will be well known to many of you for his intrepid reporting on China. He wrote for many years for the Wall Street Journal, where he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. You may have seen recently some of his occasional front-page stories for the New York Times, where he now contributes to their China coverage from time to time. And I'm happy to say he now writes frequently for the New York Review of Books, where he has become our own one-man Beijing bureau. What you may not know is that Ian also has extensive scholarly training as well. He was a student in China in the 1980s and then obtained an advanced degree in sinology at the Free University of Berlin before becoming a China hand himself. You can see this in his meticulous and deep reporting on the emergence of civil society in China. This was the subject of his first book, Wild Grasses. And you can also see it in the remarkable series of articles, book reviews, interviews, and dispatches he has done for the New York Review and for our new online journal, the NYR blog. In recent months, he's been following closely the Beaujolais scandal, which he did a remarkable and penetrating analysis in our pages earlier this spring. And he's been interviewing a remarkable array of figures about the current political situation and all the uncertainty going into this fall's transfer of power. So let us welcome Ian Johnson. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Orville and our guests.
Well, thanks, gents, for being here. Let's maybe start with this question. I think we're witnesses to one of the truly great experiments of human history, of a country that's been trying to reinvent itself, really for the last century. Do you both think that China has an evolved notion of where it's going? Maybe let's start with you, Rod, because you've been really watching this for quite a while.
I think they have a very strong idea of the kind of destination which they have been working towards, with enormous setbacks for well over a century, as you said. And ever since the return to power of Deng Xiaoping at the end of the 70s, the objective has been development, 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 with the aim, which patriots right back through the decades into the 19th century also had, the aim of China restoring its greatness so it no longer would be the plaything of foreign powers. And I think that what they have done over the last 30 years is what many of the communist leaders would like to have seen them do in the previous years under Mao, when they had many disasters, and that is to show the world that this is a country which will not be poor. It's going to take a long time for all 1 billion plus to come out of the poverty line, but it will not be poor, it will not be weak, and the rest of the world better accept that fact that there's a new player in the world game.
All right, I want to turn to you, Ian, but flag that for a minute, because if that goal is even partially accomplished, I'd like to get your thoughts about then what's next. But Ian, how do you respond to that general question?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the problem that they're facing, and where I think the roadmap is sort of run out, is we know where we want to go, and the current leadership is building some of the trappings of this, say, on a military level, force projection to be some sort of a great power, soft power through Confucius Institutes and things like that. But there's still a feeling, which I think is accurate, that these are still sort of superficial, and there's a taking of these trappings of the outward forms of being a great power without having the real ability to do it. And I think that the people in China still have this feeling that they're not there yet, and they aren't really sure how to take the next step. I think there's a tremendous amount of gridlock in China, to use the American term.
I would agree with your sense of uncertainty among the leaders, but I don't think it's to do with the fact that they don't know how to get stronger militarily or economically. I think the real problem is they don't know what a modernized China will be about. It's not going to be Confucian. It's not going to be Marxist-Leninist. What is it going to be about? There's no there. And this is something which the leadership have acknowledged, in the sense that they have said, we do not know quite how to relate to the people sometimes. Because in the days of Confucianism, in the days of Marxism-Leninism, whether you liked it or not, there was a relationship. It was not merely a political doctrine, it was a social doctrine as well. It bound government, leaders, and people together, whether they liked it or not. So you knew what China meant. They don't know what China means now.
So, Rod, if the first act, in a certain sense, was the quest for wealth and power, and if perhaps we are actually coming up against some line of history, and I think there's many reasons to feel that at some point we either are or will, then what is the next act?
It's difficult to say what the next act is when the leadership of China doesn't seem to know. So it's a little bold for us to walk in. But I think that the next act has to be a realization that leaders and led in China, like in any other country, have to have a basis of trust and a basis of empowerment in the part of the people. I'm not suggesting that they have to go to democratic elections tomorrow, anything like that. But what I am saying is that they've got to find a way in which they can persuade the people of China that despite all the corruption, and the government, the party is terribly corrupt, despite all the damage to the environment, which is enormous, Ian, I think, has written about this, that somehow the government is their government. At the moment, it's just the government. It's the leaders. It's them in Beijing, far away. It's not their government. They have no possession of that government, like they have no possession of any ideas which link them to that government. And the next step has to be for them to find a way to get that relationship if they can.
And they talk about it enough. I mean,
Yes.
they talk constantly about political reform, and this always gets journalists very excited. You know, the Wen Jiabao will bring up political reform once a year or once every couple of years, and people will go, this means they're going to reevaluate Tiananmen Square and the whole thing. But I think they don't really know what they mean by it.
They know what they don't mean by it.
They know what they don't mean by it. Well, they have a vague idea that it'll be a little more, somehow a little more responsive. There'll be some means for the citizenry to have some input, some feedback, but there isn't, I don't think, anything more than that. There isn't really any sense.
And yet, traditionally speaking, one can't say that was an incredible compact between the people and the government, that the government ruled and the people were ruled. So why this sudden craving now?
Because they've been opened up to the outside world over the last 30 years in a way that they hadn't been for 3,000. They are now aware of how other people live. They are aware that other countries, they may not want to live there, but that there are other ways of governing. There are ways in which you don't feel worried that the police are going to take you away because they don't like the art that you've just done. And the world has been opened up. And the government, as you well know, Orville, attempts to prevent many things getting through. And every time they do something to the internet, the hackers find a way around it.
So in effect, bourgeois spiritual pollution, which was always an issue, has actually come to pass.
Yes. And they did it themselves. Deng Xiaoping did it by opening up.
And a few flies came in.
Right.
A whole lot.
Does it surprise you two that things have been as durable as they have been? I mean, I remember being in Beijing in 1989, standing during the middle of the demonstrations in that traffic kiosk in front of Mao's portrait and thinking, they're never going to get this back in the bottle. And they did. And they've had a pretty good run.
They got it back in the box in one sense and not in another sense. The mothers of the sons who were killed, or daughters who were killed at Tiananmen, have never given up. And Tiananmen is not going to be forgotten. I mean, if I had advice for the new leader of China, it'd be the same advice I gave to Hu Jintao. And that is, he should do three things and be absolutely wonderful for him. He should redress the verdicts on Tiananmen, and all the intellectuals would be behind him. He would, he'd let in the Dalai Lama so that he'd be a bird in a gilded cage in Tibet, and he'd have Richard Gere off his back. And he would take one senior leader or family and have them up for corruption, not for some political device as they have done in the past. And then the whole of China would back him.
And did he take your advice, Rod?
Nor do I expect Xi Jinping to do it either.
Well, this has been a long historical problem, hasn't it, of Western advice not being very readily absorbed or received.
Well, they're a long-lived and proud civilization. Why should they take our advice?
But I think this advice would come from a lot of Chinese people.
I'm sure.
So I don't think it would just be, you know, I think you're right on Tiananmen. I think that's one issue that would be probably impossible for the government to do right now, but it's something that they could do and gain a lot. But the corruption, I don't think that would do it. I don't think taking a member of the standing committee, and essentially they may be doing this with Bo Xilai. We don't know how that's going to play out. There could be corruption that's part of charges against him. But people know that it's more than just one person, that the system is endemically corrupt because there are no checks and balances, however you want to formulate the checks and balances, that the system itself leads to absolute corruption, and practically everybody in the system at any level is corrupt to some degree.
And yet, it has led to an incredible 2 decades of growth and a certain amount of legitimacy that has come out of that growth. It's a curious compact with the people. but does that have a shelf life that's...
I think the compact has been a different one. After Tiananmen, I think the compact was, you can say and think what you like, just don't go to Tiananmen Square and denounce the government or try to form a party or Charter 08 or whatever it is against the Communist Party. You can get on with what you're doing and we'll try our best to make you rich. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the compact. Mm-hmm. And as the coastal areas have got rich and as that riches spread slowly inland, people are going to be accepting of the way things are. Mm-hmm. That's why the country is, as Li Peng once said in a interview that I was part of, the country is in a state of extreme stability.
That's always want to put a flag up whenever the word extreme appears. So, Ian, how do you explain the last 20 years? And have you been surprised, or do you think it's all predictable?
Well, you see, of course, all the low-level local protests, the reports that there are over 100,000 or 150,000 mass incidents every year. But the economic growth paves over a lot of cracks. And I think for a lot of people, life has gotten a lot better. And there are opportunities that have opened up for so many people that they're willing to overlook a lot of the problems in society. So in essence, the government's compact has worked, but I think long term, you do have this kind of modernization dilemma where you get more players who are active in society, you have a better educated population. It's not an iron law that it's going to happen with a certain amount of per capita GDP, but I think that you do see this at the local level and at small towns and where people are becoming, they want more of a say over their life. Not necessarily I want to elect the person, but I just don't want this absolutely arbitrary form of government where I have almost no input and the craziest decisions can be made. I don't want that kind of a system. I think you get more and more people who feel that way. Mm-hmm. So.
And in fact, as a result of the trashing of the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution at Mao's orders, you have people prepared, despite the power of the 80 million members of the party, prepared at a local level to stand up against local corrupt officials. We saw this in the village Wukan in Guangdong late last year. And the point is that no longer are people prepared to accept that the way things have always been done, the corrupt official does this and you say yes sir, no sir, they're not prepared to accept that if there's widespread pollution which causes damage to their children and they are thrown out of their houses in order to make way for a factory. It's just no longer acceptable. And I think it's now 500, Chinese academics estimate 500 incidents a day, mm-hmm. which is about 180,000. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then, to return to my earlier question, how do you explain that things have progressed over the last 2 decades plus now, as well as they have? Is this something that surprised you both?
What did Deng Xiaoping do? What Deng Xiaoping did was what Mao's revolution promised in '49 and didn't do. Mm-hmm. It was called the liberation. It wasn't. It was a straitjacketization. What Deng Xiaoping did was to liberate people in a limited sense, but economically, to work and earn money, to get rich was glorious. And the fact that people have been allowed to, on behalf of themselves, their families, to get richer, that has made for some stability. Because it may not be good for the country as a whole, but people all over are striving. And it's the industry of these people, I mean the industriousness of these people, working in Western factories, working in Taiwanese factories, working in Korean factories, working in Chinese factories, that has produced this miracle. And it's because they've been told it's no longer collectivization rules. You can make money, mm-hmm. help your family. That's what can happen.
But I think there's also, to give the party some credit, the party has learned, or is able to learn and adapt over time. And if you look at a very controversial issue from 1999, 2000, the crackdown on Falun Gong, with the absolute heavy-handed methods that were used to crush this, even if you believe that it was a religious cult, but completely out of proportion to the problem. And most human rights groups agree that up to 100 people were killed in police custody. So you don't have to accept all the Falun Gong stuff, but it was a pretty horrendous series of human rights abuses that lasted for a year. Now, when there are protests, you don't see such. There are, of course, cases of the police beating people to death and so on, but it's not to the same degree of brutality. And I think the party has gotten much more sophisticated in how they control dissent, the incredible expansion. And I'm not necessarily saying this is great, but it shows an adaptiveness. The growth in soft detention and those sort of things. And then if you look at the issue, people maybe turn to things like Falun Gong because there was a spiritual hunger. The established religions in China were very limited in scope, but Qigong, because it was not a religion, could essentially proselytize and grew around the country. The government cracked down on it, cut it down, and over the past decade or so, dozen years, has allowed the established religious groups to grow a lot faster than in the past. And I think this is partly a conscious decision on the government's part, that in essence, most of this spiritual hunger, it's not threatening to party rule as long as independent organizations don't grow up. So I think they are able to say, yeah, we can allow, for example, some religiosity in Chinese life that we didn't allow in the past, but we just don't want we don't want it to become politicized. And that's something that I didn't foresee, for example, in 99, 2000, when they cracked down on Falun Gong. So I think you can see in that and in other cases as well, where the party is able to some degree, adapt to changes.
I think that's true at the top level. What I think is also the case is that the top levels have either lost control or turned their eyes in another direction with reference to the lower levels. And I think we see this with the blind lawyer Chan, now resident in this city. As long as economic development which deprives peasants of their land does not result in riots, with someone phoning Ian Johnson in Beijing and saying, there's a riot in my village, will you report it, please? As long as that doesn't happen, then the center is prepared to turn its eyes the other direction. And I think that the lower levels have not learned because they don't need to learn. Because for the party at the top to do anything about the lower levels, both the corruption and the toughness with which they treat the local population, would require another cultural revolution. They're not going to launch that.
You know, there's a very interesting article in the New York Review of Books, it so happens, issued just before the one many of you have in your laps, reporting or reviewing a book that suggests, in effect, that one of the things that the Chinese leadership learned from the Cultural Revolution was a kind of a guerrilla pragmatism. Actually, within the rigidity of the system, an immense flexibility to do what has to be done to survive. And I wonder how you two respond to that.
I think what they learned most, and Ian's written about this, I think what they learned most was that in times of extreme chaos domestically, the only people you can depend on are your family. And I think that you've got to remember that when the communist regime was first set up in the 50s, the People's Daily would publish things, usually by bourgeois kids. I wish to draw a line between myself and my counter-revolutionary parents. This was very common at that time. And some of those kids took it seriously. At the time,
Bourgeois, evidently.
Right. So that's what we're told. But in the case of the Cultural Revolution, you found that even your best friend might not be your best friend if he was in another Red Guard group. And the only people you could really rely upon were your family, if they were anywhere near, which sometimes they weren't. So I think family came out of the Cultural Revolution, importance of family. And that is one of the problems in today's China, that family and increasing the wealth of the family, especially in the upper levels of the party, is a major problem.
And indeed, Mao had identified this as a problem, that families were in effect feudal structures, which sort of distracted people from the great proletarian undertaking of building the nation.
Yeah, and I remember a very sardonic newspaper editor, Chinese newspaper editor, said to me, "Thank you very much, you Americans, for the Korean War because you killed Mao's son. And if you hadn't done that, we'd be just like North Korea and we'd have a Mao in charge of the country now."
Instead, we almost got his wife.
Yeah, right.
No, the Chinese would never have allowed a woman to take over.
Yeah. Well, they have had a few cases.
Yes, and they've been excoriated by historians down the ages.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. You know, where are the women in the Chinese Communist Revolution and one might say counter-revolution?
Yeah, and you've been closer to them than I have.
Well, they've been killing British businessmen, I think. No, I mean, it almost fits into perfectly that the arch villain in the saga is a woman.
A dragon
right?
lady.
Yeah, dragon lady, sort of slightly psychotic. And there's been a steady stream of character assassination rumors about her depraved lifestyle. And sort of the best you can say for her is that she might have bone cancer, and this might explain everything. But other than that, it's she's just crazy. And then Bo sort of ends up being an accessory to murder because he tried to cover up for his wife. But what husband wouldn't with such a wife? So, you know, he sort of comes off looking like the okay guy almost in the way they're trying to sell this. Although we haven't got the official story yet, but this is the way it's sort of coming out.
Hard to imagine him as a victim of anybody, including a wife on the rampage.
No, because he was clearly didn't have a close relationship with his wife. But no, I think you don't see very many women at the top in China, and there is a chance that there'll be one in the new standing committee. And would that be the first time ever, or?
They've had them
I
in the
don't
Politburo.
I think there's ever been.
Politburo, but never as high as that.
Never in the standing committee. Yeah. So.
No, according to Mao, the women hold up half the sky, but just so long as they're not seen.
Yeah. Well, in fact, they do hold up half the sky. I mean, anybody who knows China at all realizes that women are an incredible driving force, both within the family and also at other levels. I mean, while the men sit around drinking tea, it's often the women who are really running the place.
Well, that's a problem because, of course, they'll drink tea and then no one will be running the place because they have killed off too many girl babies.
All right. You want to comment, Ian?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think the main problem facing, but there is a problem, not just in women, but you see it in all sorts of participation, that you have a very homogenous group running the country. And although China has 55 or is it 56 minorities, ethnic groups at least, you don't see any really in any significant positions of power. And this is, of course, another problem that the country faces.
Actually, under Mao, they had a Uyghur and a Mongol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
They don't do that now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if we sort of look at what's going on, you've both alluded indirectly to this sort of crisis of values and belief system, and you suggested, Ian, there was a hunger for some sort of spiritual value. I mean, it used to be a question that was pretty neatly answered at home and in politics by Confucianism and Buddhism. If you, wanted to exercise your spiritual side. What's happening now, and what might we expect in terms of this part of their self-reinvention?
Well, I think it's very difficult because a lot of identity was also local, and people obviously lived in villages. They had a village identity, and worshipped communally. And now with this incredible urbanization that's going on, you have a huge amount of alienation as well. People don't really feel a part of any system. It's not only political, but I think they don't know who's in charge of even their families. And there's been some powerful work done on this, especially that documentary film that came out a couple of years ago about the, was it Last Train Home, I think, that shows the incredible social fragmentation that's going on, and fragmentation of families. And I think if you live in Beijing, you quickly find people who are in this very difficult situation of moving to the city, not having any infrastructure, nothing to bind them. The lack of civil society there really comes through. There's nothing like a YMCA or those sort of things. The party infrastructure is almost non-existent. So the only people who are really active out on the streets are the Chengguan, sort of urban management teams, but they're widely hated by the people that they're supposed to be sort of looking out for. They look out for them only in a police sense, that they don't.
Don't you still have groups living together who are from somewhere else, like the Wenzhou area in Beijing?
Yeah, you do have a bit of that, although they continually try to knock these places down. But people usually come to a city because they know somebody else there from their hometown or their village. And again, it gets back to what you're saying about the importance of family. These are the only, or clan, they're the only people you can count on. But that doesn't create a really cohesive society or a cohesive sense of nation. It creates small, very siloed individual lives. And a sense of social spirit is often lacking. Chinese people talk about it all the time. So I think it's one of the reasons you see a growth in alternative education as well. Parents who are sending their kids to, if they can afford it, of course, but Montessori, Waldorf schools. These are all growing exponentially because they think this creates a sense of cooperation rather than a zero-sum game mentality, which is predominant in society.
Ironically, a value which, even in its sort of cryptic form during the Cultural Revolution, was very much inculcated into every level of society, a kind of service, equality, even though class struggle was
class struggle outweighed
yeah.
service. Service, I think serve the people was a genuine motto before the Cultural Revolution, even during the time of the famine, though many local officials protected their families rather than the villagers who were under their control. But serve the people meant something then. And I think what has happened is that the morality of the Communist Party was destroyed by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. And the party comes out of that, individuals thinking, well, you know, if that's the way they treat me, I'm going to go for myself and my family. Yeah,
retreat to the lowest common denominator of society.
Exactly.
So let's turn for a minute. Let's see, what time is it? I want to take plenty of time for questions. But I want to talk a little bit about China's sort of perception of itself in the world. And this very deep concern and fixation now on how it's presented, and desiring to figure out how do you get, as if you could just get, soft power. So first of all, let me ask you, what do you both sort of think is behind this tremendously strong concern about China's image abroad that we now see?
Well, I think that the Chinese feel that the kind of achievement that they have genuinely made over the last 3 decades, the kind of size they occupy within the world scene, both economically and population-wise and so on, should result in a better image of China in the outside world. And they don't quite understand why that isn't so. And they think that soft power, which has become a mantra, you know, At one point, there was an academic almost every month coming and saying, now, tell me about soft power. How can we do that?
How can we get some?
Yeah. And a feeling that this is something the state can do by the creation of Confucius Institute. They don't realize that the only way you can get soft power is by having a vibrant civil society which throws off ideas and music and drama and all sorts of things which people abroad look at and say, great, we want to copy that. We want to do that. American popular music has now become Taiwanese popular music. Taiwanese popular music has swept the mainland. You know, that kind of soft power is something which they just haven't managed because they don't like the idea of society getting out of control.
And yet, Rod, I have to say that I have two sons in 20-year-old range, both who speak Chinese. And when they go to China, I mean, I get a little window into what is an incredibly vibrant sort of youth scene.
culture.
Now, maybe not the deepest culture in the universe, but it's really vibrant. It's a kind of soft power. There is hardly anybody of that age who wouldn't have fun in Beijing or Shanghai today. So how are they missing that? Why are they?
Well, they're not projecting it.
Yeah.
Because you could ask the audience how many of them know about this vibrant youth culture in China. You assume that youth are vibrant anywhere.
Well,
Because we're certainly not.
But I think that China's civil society has to grow up and it has to produce things which civil societies elsewhere recognize and wish to copy. I mean, your sons may come back as ambassadors for this youth culture, who knows?
I thought it was really telling, though, that I just read yesterday, the day before, that Stan Lee, the creator of Spider-Man and some other comic heroes, he's now created interestingly enough, a guy who gets his superpower from Qigong, which I thought was a sort of rehabilitation of, but he's called the Annihilator. And in China's like, we've got, Stan Lee on our side, but he's created somebody called the Annihilator.
and Superman, when he first came onto the scene, he was really peace-loving, no violence, nobody ever died.
Yeah.
I mean, he was quite, how shall I put it, even a little effete by today's standards. Interesting.
So the Annihilator is another way of calling him Terminator.
Yes, yeah. But there's this idea of, that you can sort of just get somebody to make a superhero for you, and then this will be.
So where does China have real soft power?
I think, in fact, what we all realize, though we don't think of it this way, is that if a country has hard power, people will be interested in its culture and what makes it tick. And why, long before the Confucius Institute became the latest instrument of Chinese propaganda, many people in this country were starting to learn Chinese at quite a young age. Schools across the country were beginning to teach Chinese at a very young age. And I think that's because China was rising, and this is very impressive, and so you want to know what makes them tick, and one way you do that is by learning the language. So hard power is an essential ingredient of soft power. There are probably some wonderful smaller countries without much hard power, but also have wonderful soft power, but we don't know about it.
And you see them all in Beijing. There's an incredible array of cultural centers, and every country is trying to project its image into China, probably for economic reasons, but also the idea that this is the country of tomorrow and we want to count, and don't forget,
But this is a little bit counterintuitive, isn't it? You both have described a country sort of on the verge of various kinds of breakdown, and yet, Ian, here you're saying everybody wants to go to China.
Ferment. I think it's ferment. It's a country in ferment, and a lot of things percolating up from below. You can see signs of, yes, a social dislocation and protests and riots and stuff like that, but you also see a lot of vibrancy, and there isn't really too much contradiction there. In the party's mind, perhaps there's contradiction, because they want only the good, the clean. They don't want any of the messiness that comes with a real vibrant society. But they're getting it. In terms of soft power, you can see it here, all the people who have come to this talk. There's a huge amount of sympathy and interest in China. around the United States and in countries around China, all the efforts by foundations to find Chinese, to come and study, to take photographs, to do this and to do that. I mean, they're just, foundations are almost scouring China for candidates, and I think that also shows that China is on the rise. But the party wants to control this and lead it. And we saw that, I think, decades ago with, if you wanted to, and I'm not sure if this is absolutely true, but for a while there was an effort in the 1980s, if you wanted to have an academic exchange program with China, you had to use Chinese textbooks, and they wanted universities to use simplified characters, for example. But
I don't think actually either of us used the word breakdown. I think the situation is, what you've got to remember about politics is that inertia is the most powerful force in it. And that China, as it is at the moment, will continue as it is at the moment, with growing problems that we know about and which an economist among us could expatiate at, an ecologist could tell us more. But unless there is some traumatic development, because Chinese history in the last 150 years has progressed through trauma. 3 great changes have been as a result of trauma. Unless there is a traumatic development, people will get a little bit richer, riches will spread a little further, people will still be rioting in their local villages when things go wrong. But inertia is very powerful.
Okay, well, before we start some questions from you all, you're describing a kind of muddle along scenario from here.
If I were in the Politburo Standing Committee, I would devoutly want to muddle along.
Yes, well, I think they do devoutly want to. But the question is, will they be allowed to have another decade of kind of just peaceful evolution?
Well, if you can think of a trauma.
Well, sometimes you don't need to think of them. I mean, the world is replete with these things that just spring up out of nowhere.
Well,
are you optimistic that the next 10 years will be ones where we'll have this sort of piecemeal, lots of problems, but things cohere and move forward? That's the subject of our panel tonight.
You came here from California where there's a San Andreas fault.
Yes.
Everyone says it's going to blow, but no one says when.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I don't know when the trauma is going to take place.
I take your point, but that implies that there is some instability aloft.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Ian, how about you?
I think a lot of economists, it's always become a truism when you talk to people in China, they'll say the next 10 years of reforms, just economic reforms, forget the political reforms, are as important as the past 30 years. And there are so many things that really need to be tackled. But this runs up against, here we do get into politics. You need to break the state's monopoly over so many industries and so many areas of life. There's about a dozen key industries where the state has declared that it will have either a monopolistic position or some sort of a leading position, which crowds out private enterprise. When you think of a dozen industries, and we're talking about really the key industries in the country, that begins to be a real problem. And most Chinese economists you talk to at universities and think tanks, they all agree that this is an issue, but you don't really see any kind of a program. If I compare it to the 15th Party Congress, we're coming up to the 18th Party Congress. So 15 years ago, when I was in Beijing with the Wall Street Journal, around this time before the Congress, there was a clear plan by Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji to, zhuo da fang xiao, to grasp the big companies and release the small state-owned enterprises. That was a bold plan of reform that's led China into the WTO. And this is already being talked about, because when these things are afoot in China, it's not a secret that's going to be unveiled on October the 20th or whenever the thing ends. People are talking about it. There are working groups. There are thousands of people who know this. And right now, you don't hear anything like that at all. It could happen. It could be that Xi Jinping is just really playing his cards really, really well and doesn't want to scare anyone, or it might not happen until next year at the National People's Congress. But you don't get a sense that there is any kind of a, I don't want to say visionary, but there's any kind of a bold step that's about to happen.
I think the one name we haven't mentioned is being Gorbachev. The Chinese leadership, sorry?
Don't mention Gorbachev.
The Chinese leadership have had films, they've had professors talking to them, and they've discussed Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union endlessly. And what did Gorbachev do? He took a risk. He couldn't get the state apparatus to change. So he launched a mini-cultural revolution. He launched people to attack the bureaucracy in the newspapers, intellectually. And the last thing they want to do is to take a risky endeavor like that. No one wants to be the Gorbachev of China. Liu Shaoqi was sadly named the Khrushchev of China by Mao Zedong. No one wants to be the Gorbachev because that's the end of the Chinese Communist Party.
All right, before, let me just quickly ask both of you, how do you think our relationship with China is going to evolve? Where do you think it is now, and what can we expect this coming year? It's a very important bilateral relationship.
Well, the United States has done quite a bit to ensure that its relationship with Xi Jinping would be good. Frank, Joe Biden has said, but good. And every attempt was made in this very tortuous negotiations about the blind lawyer Chen in order to save China's face in a situation which almost was impossible to save face. Yeah. So I think that Xi Jinping ought to feel that the United States wants to work with him. Now, whether circumstances turn out in a way that that proves more difficult than at present seems possible, we don't know. But I think that relationships should be good for the transition.
Yeah?
Yeah, I agree. I think it will carry forward fairly smoothly, but there are always these issues that crop up every few years, and China is just an example of one that you can't predict. And this one went off relatively smoothly. Both sides are probably pretty happy with how it went off, but there could be something else that happens as well that we just can't imagine. And those could be hard to negotiate if something happens. If the Chen case happens, let's say, in late October or early November before the election, it could have ended up a bit differently, perhaps. So.
Okay, so let's hear from you all. There will be microphones, so raise your hand. Let's see, right here. Raise your hand and then we'll bring it to you.
I don't know where to start. You've raised so many wonderful questions. One that I like to have at least tossed around is the migration problem, which China seems to have a gridlock in migration that's even worse than the United States, because we're dealing with people who are nominally Chinese and they can't even move to a city and integrate into the city the way Americans take for granted. The second issue is the relationship between the national and the local government that was brought up earlier. This seems to be China is supposed to be a unitary state, and yet they don't. If anything goes wrong, it gets blamed at the local level. This seems to, after a while, build up and kind of point back to say there's people up there that may be controlling things. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'll handle I'll talk about the migration. Yeah, there's a huge amount of migration going on. I think at the end of last year, for the first time in Chinese history, a majority of people lived in cities as opposed to the countryside. And I remember at the beginning of my Chinese studies, the ratio was always sort of 80-20. People always said 80% countryside, 20% cities. So there's been a huge shift that's gone on. But so the party wants to control this, and Beijing now only has, I don't know, 18 million people or something, but not 100 million people, because they're trying to create these catchment cities. And you see urbanization going on at the very local level, where county seats are being turned into cities, and then they're building a huge number of apartment blocks. And then villages are being torn down often and just replaced by a couple of apartment blocks. You can just fit everyone in the village in these blocks. And as these cities grow, they want that land. So that's another reason why they tear down the village, build an apartment block, and it becomes a suburb of the city and eventually a district of the city. But this leads to huge tensions, and I think the town that everyone was looking at earlier this year, or last year, Eakin in Guangdong province, is an example of that. It was a real estate deal, essentially, that everyone objected to, how the communal property was being sold off, and again, with no input by people. So the urbanization is happening, the party is trying to control it, but the way they are controlling it, again, leads to a feeling of arbitrary control over people's lives and to discontent. And a lot of it depends on the locality, of course, how well it's carried off. But this is, I'm sure, behind these 180,000 protests every year, I bet 100,000 at least have to do with real estate deals in Chinese cities.
And they do have, at the moment, they have the policy of the new socialist countryside, which involves a lot of money, and it's supposed to benefit the peasantry. But one way that local officials feel they can use the money best, and it shows them off, is by building these towns you've just described. Tearing down the villages and decanting people out of their old houses, many of which probably they may be glad to be out of, into an apartment, which has no connection to the land at all. Now, I was listening to him so closely, I forgot the second question which I'm supposed to answer.
You spoke earlier about the relationship between...
Oh, yes, center and the localities. I think if a local official wants one day to be a contender, wants to be a member of the Central Committee, perhaps even higher, then that person is going to be very careful about his or her actions over the course of their career. But if your attitude as a local official is, I'm never going to get up to Beijing, I'm never going to be a member of the Central Committee, I'm going to have a good life for my family. There are really two criteria that the central government hands down. One is develop. And the other is keep law and order. In other words, I said earlier, just make sure they don't damn well phone the Wall Street Journal or wherever Ian Johnson's reporting from at that particular time. And unless, as I said earlier, unless the center is irritated because something has hit the world's press, and goodness knows, you know these people, how quickly they're able to communicate with Western journalists and get their story out. As long as that doesn't happen, well, the center it's got its general policy, the outcomes are up to you down there. And so in that sense, it's not the tight totalitarian state that seemed to be the case in the Maoist era.
Okay, next question, right here on the edge.
You both seem to indicate that what the Chinese leadership would want to have is 10 more years of quiet development and very stable, non-confrontational relationships with other parts of the world. Whereas if you listen to the pronouncements from at least some of the speeches from the People's Liberation Army, they are much more assertive in their view about what Chinese role ought to be, both in South China Sea as well as in other parts of the world. Do you see a scenario whereby the Chinese People's Liberation Army in fact becomes a larger force in the upcoming years, given the wealth and power they have amassed, and therefore, rather than this quiet 10 years that you are projecting, it will be much more tumultuous and next 10, 15, 20 years based on their own image of what their destiny should be in terms of power.
Ian's probably met some of these people, but I'm told that these bellicose generals are, in fact, retired people who like to get their faces on television and to be popular and to state nationalistic aims in a rather belligerent manner is apparently one way to get yourself popular, because as you probably know, the internet, the blogosphere it's called, in China on foreign issues can be roused to extremes of nationalism. And it's to that audience that these people are playing. I think, however, that they are licensed in the sense that they could be shut up tomorrow. You know, a general could be told, you know, you're going to lose your car, you're going to lose your apartment, just shut up. But they don't tell them that, because I think it's useful for implicitly the leadership to say, we've got some toughies out there. They don't want to, you know, push us too far because the toughies are there. So I think there is a hidden motive in allowing those people to speak. The People's Liberation Army is an important issue, and the control of it was to Mao the most important thing in his power. When it seemed that Lin Biao could also control the People's Liberation Army, he was eased out and finally fled the country. And of course, the People's Liberation Army does not like, no army in the world likes the idea of firing on their own people. The reputation you get for firing on your own people is not a good one. And that's what happened in Tiananmen. And only someone like Deng Xiaoping and his immediate colleagues with their revolutionary reputation could have ordered that and had the order obeyed. And so I think the issue for the leaders to come, as it has been for Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, is can we make sure, and there are always articles saying you've got to be loyal to the party, can we be sure that the party, that the army will obey us in a real crisis? Or will it say, we've had enough trying to pick the chestnuts out of the fire for the party, it's just too long that we've done this? I think on balance, probably the inertia prevails. The party will continue to tell the army what to do, and the army will continue, as long as it gets money for toys and so on, will continue to genuflect in the general direction of Zhongnanhai.
I would agree. I think the only problem is there's a certain inevitability. When you stake out claims, say to the South China Sea, that 30 years ago were sort of irrelevant because you didn't have anything more than coastal craft, so you couldn't really enforce your claim, that big sort of sack that goes down to all the countries in Southeast Asia, that it didn't really matter that you had these claims. Now you have these claims, and you're modernizing your military, throwing lots of money, building an aircraft carrier, you'll build another aircraft carrier. There becomes a certain inevitability. Well, if we really have this claim, if this is really our territory, then we have to defend it. And now we have the means to defend it. I mean, I don't mean now, this year, but sometime down the road there will be the means. And there are already some sort of conflicts with the Philippines and some other countries that still are a lot of posturing, and things haven't resulted and aren't close to any sort of violence. But you could see that as the military force grows, that there could be a real potential. And I think that it may not be in 5 years, but at some point down the road, China will have to either compromise, but the more that they print all the maps, all have this claim, it's staked out there, and military people tend to be say hardliners when it comes to defending national soil. So I don't know what will happen in the longer term. I'm not quite so sure. I think they will stay under party control in the foreseeable future, but if the politicians no longer back these positions, there may be pressure to say, well, we want to have a general on the standing committee because we don't think you are representing our interests, the interests of China, defending Chinese sovereignty and territory, the sacred mission of any Chinese government, especially after the 19th century. We don't think you're doing it. Right now they are, but in the future it's hard to know. So that's why when China declares, as they've done, they declare core interests. They've kept ratcheting up what's a core interest.
It's very dangerous. There's no backtracking.
Yeah, because at that point, you essentially have locked yourself into this position, especially with the military. I think.
Well, the Chinese had actually been playing Southeast Asia extremely well until about 3 years ago, when they started to become tougher on these claims in the South China Seas, where Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries also have claims. And with the possibility of mineral deposits, petroleum, whatever, this becomes important. It's more than just an issue of history. But I think that the Chinese civilian leadership has to decide, are we going to get into a situation where, because of these claims to these tiny rocks, which we could jointly explore and recover our reputation with Southeast Asia, are we going to do that, or are we going to keep pressing, as some of the military might like us to do, the result of which will be what we keep saying we don't want and what we fear, namely a de facto or actual alliance between America, Japan, Australia, India, and anyone else who wants to throw their hat into the ring against Chinese expansionism.
I think that's the logical outcome, but the problem, and here you get to the change in the nature of the leadership over the decades, you have a leadership by consensus. You no longer have the big dominant person like a Deng who could...
Or a Bo Xilai.
Or a Bo Xilai who could push through something, who could make a historic compromise and say, yeah, that's all our territory, but actually we're not going to really enforce it. We're going to cut a deal with these countries and do that. That takes a lot of political capital, takes a lot of courage. And at least the past 10 years has been a leadership without much courage. It hasn't exhibited much courage on any tough issues at all. So does the new guy have the wherewithal to do that? That's sort of the big question. But these questions, it's not just in foreign policy, it's also economic and so on and so forth. They require some kind of an icebreaker type personality who can cut through all these competing interests.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Because I think China had its dose of big leaders.
Right. Who wants to scramble?
Actually the West had a dose of big leaders. And now China has gotten rid of its big leaders, and it ends up with this kind of treacly government that can't make big decisions, and we have a certain nostalgia for that kind of breakthrough ability.
After Stalin and Khrushchev, you had Brezhnev.
Yes, well, that's true. But we don't see any sign, at least till now, that China is going to have a new big leader culture anytime soon.
Well, no one thought Khrushchev would be.
Yeah. Okay, let's move right along. Here's from the web. I have read about China introducing somewhat democratic elections for local party officers some years ago and thought it might be the basis for a slow, controlled rollout of democratic principles. Is this evolutionary process continuing? How far along is it?
I think the answer is it has not been rolled out much further than it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. There were experiments, or more than experiments, with village democracy, where you would have, let's say, 5 positions and 7 or 8 candidates. You have, the key is to have more candidates than positions, obviously, and that way the people. But I'm not saying multi-party democracy. Just FYI, I thought. The key is, of course, that way you can. If you got a really bad, corrupt SOB in there, you can say, okay, well, he's not one of he's the 6th person or the 7th person. He's not one of the 5 who gets elected. And that was a safety valve. But it was an interesting safety valve. It was an interesting effort. But it sort of stayed in the nascent stage. And you do have elections, but they tend to be sort of one position, one...
The lowest levels.
Yeah, at the lowest levels. And there were... experiments, I think in Sichuan, there was one county where they wanted to have these elections. That would be the next level up, or a township, I guess maybe it was a township in Sichuan. And then,
where there's real power.
Yeah, where there's real power, rather than just the village. But that didn't go anywhere. But of course, this is one of the Taiwan models.
But the attitude, I mean, I went to a conference run by, many years ago, run by the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which was in charge of village democracy. And they were a very idealistic group of people who really wanted democracy and saw this as the beginning. And but they had a certain view of how democracy should be run. It's exactly what Ian's saying.
That's
Yeah, the point was, I explained to them that in Britain, or in America for that matter, any crook could run for election, and provided he or she got the votes, they would be elected. Whereas they were much more Confucian. You select a couple of candidates, both well-educated, relatively speaking, both as honest as you could find, and they had a choice between two good candidates. No crooks need apply. This was very much controlled.
Sounds like a pretty good system, right? Okay, question right there in the back.
That gentleman on the side is trying to get out.
You've spoken of the relationship between the rulers and the ruled and the stresses in that relationship. Would you like to say anything about the relationship between rich and poor and the growing inequality and class consciousness?
It's the same thing.
I was going to say back to the rulers and the ruled.
Yeah, because I think you're right. There's a huge income disparity, by all accounts, the largest in the world, or largest of a major country in the world.
And the gap is widening.
And the gap is widening. And that's why I think change in China is most likely to come from below. I have very little confidence in the elites, because I think the elites have been mostly bought off. So all the super rich in China, all the people who are engaged in interesting things at the super top levels of society, entrepreneurs and so on, I don't hold out much hope for them changing things, because I think they have gained stupendously over the past couple of decades.
Would you please wait a minute, sir? Please wait a minute. Continue.
Yeah, well, I think that's the main thing. So I think there's a huge issue that hasn't really been addressed.
What I think is the case is that, sort of like in the West to some extent, is that you are much more concerned if your neighbor has got a higher income or more wealth than you, especially if you assume that that wealth has been attained illegitimately. And you don't sort of you don't have the movie magazines quite in the same number as you do here. You don't see the rich every day parading in front of you, because one thing, at least as far as I can tell, is that they like to keep their wealth quiet. Now, it is true that Forbes, I think, has listed some of the Chinese billionaires, so they're well known perhaps outside more than inside China. But so far, there hasn't been. The Bo Xilai case, for instance, has not brought widespread anger about the riches which people in high positions can accumulate for themselves and their families. But if this kind of thing continues, then that might be a serious problem for the leadership. How to justify the fact that they or their relatives have these vast amounts of money under their control.
And interesting, this is, of course, where the revolution began against the Kuomintang. The nationalists was, to a certain degree, rich against poor.
In some ways, China's in some ways like the United States, because there's this huge gap in the United States, but there's this national myth or story in the United States that if I work hard enough I can get ahead, I can become the next Bill Gates, or I can send my kid to Harvard or whatnot. And in China, this is not as deeply embedded, let's say, in the national consciousness. But I think over the past 30 years, there has been this feeling of all boats are rising. Things are a lot better than they were in the past. And so that makes people perhaps less resentful of the super rich, because they think they can get ahead. Whether this continues or not, I don't think the growth will be as strong in the future as it has been in the past. So that could lead to resentment.
All right, we have time for one more question right here. Yes, second row.
You've given us a great sense of the social forces and social tensions that are swirling around China. But I wonder if you can, it almost sounds as if the party is a kind of unified force, and I wonder if you can talk about the party and what's going on behind the scenes there. Presumably there are going to be a lot of negotiations in Beidaihe this summer before the change of leadership in the fall. And I wonder how split the party is, what are the factions, and is there kind of a reform, so-called reform faction versus a more conservative faction? Can you talk about the party situation? Thanks.
Let me say something about that. Before I do, let me just say one thing. You mentioned the corruption under the Kuomintang. A very senior Chinese official, retired, former chief editor of the People's Daily, told me about 10 years ago, corruption is worse today, this is the 90s, than it ever was under the Kuomintang. And he was alive at that time and knew it. I think the problem with the party at the moment, in my view, is that they've reached the end of the line of the institutional reforms which Deng Xiaoping instituted. Deng Xiaoping basically got them to agree 2 terms and up or you're out. And he basically got them to agree, there are always exceptions, 70, you retire, no office for life. What he didn't do was to change the method of selection of the leader. Mao chose 4 successors, and none of them lasted. One survived him, but didn't last. Deng Xiaoping also chose 4 successors. 2 didn't last, but he blessed Jiang Zemin and he blessed Hu Jintao. End of the line. There is no legitimation procedure for the Chinese communist leader. And I think that one of the dangers that Bo Xilai, a thruster, if ever there was one, charismatic from what one can tell, posed for the Chinese leadership, was that if he was in the Politburo Standing Committee, as he clearly wanted to be and felt that he'd made the case for himself to be, then he could have been a challenge to Xi Jinping, who does not seem to be as charismatic, as high profile as Bo Xilai was. And one of the reasons for being able to challenge him is because he arose as a result of a backdoor deal. Nothing official, nothing transparent. He wasn't, in fact, supposedly the first choice of Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao did not have the clout to choose his successor, nor did Jiang Zemin. And so what you have in the party at the moment, which is a fundamental issue, is the lack of legitimacy in any recognizable sense by the institution itself of the leadership. Now, when you add to that the issues of should we have political reform, as Ian said earlier, poor Mr. Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, has been talking about that for years. I think he wants his place in history because nothing has happened, but maybe one day it will and people will remember. But there are people who want political reform, at least at a slow pace. There are others who regard it as absolutely the worst thing that could possibly happen to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if the General Secretary who comes in October or November came into the Politburo Standing Committee or the Politburo one day and said, comrades, I've had an idea. Let's try democracy. He'd be out. I mean, there are 18 million people whose privileges, perks, income, wealth, corruption depends on being a member of the Communist Party. It's a wonderful Rotary Club to be a member of. And so I think there are many other problems with the party, but I think the fundamental one is that they have not got their act together institutionally, so that in October, when the Party Congress meets, everyone will say that Xi Jinping has been chosen as a result of a process which I recognize. Laying on of hands by Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong may not seem much, but it was very important, and Xi Jinping doesn't have that.
Ian, last word.
Well, I think to answer your question also about other factions, there are factions in the party, but I don't think it's as clear as in the past, where you could say there's a reformist wing and there's a conservative wing and so on and so forth. I think there are a lot of different interest groups. It's become very complex, some people supporting large state-owned enterprises and so on and so forth. That also creates this logjam, that it's harder to negotiate all of these interest groups that are clogging up the system. Sounds kind of like the United States.
I was thinking the same thought.
So I'm not, I don't think you'll see that kind of a division, or the top is certainly not ribbon. I don't think of the 9 or 7 people, however many are in the standing committee, 3 are on one side, 4 on the other, or anything like that. There are people in the party who are very pro-reform and very outspoken, and there are 80 million party members, so you do have people who are in favor of democracy in the party. But by and large, those people don't have a voice, and in a way it's kind of like the mafia. I mean, to get to the top of it, you're not going to be advocating democracy and that sort of thing. So I don't see the current leadership making any fundamental changes. There is a case to be made that Xi Jinping might have a bit more clout because he's a princeling, the son of a revolutionary veteran. He might have a bit more of a power base. He's got good ties to the military. People had made similar arguments a decade ago about Hu Jintao. So I would be very cautious. I think there's always a lot of optimism at this time of year. There's new leaders are coming in. Let's hope they're better than the old ones. And here's my case why it should be. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I just don't think people really know very much. He's never made any programmatic statement. He's never come out in favor of anything. And that's why he got where he is, right? Because he's a cipher.
And it's interesting, even after 10 years in office, Hu Jintao has never really revealed himself.
Yeah, what does he stand for? Yeah.
It's an interesting.
He stands for himself remaining in power.
And the party
stability.
remains.
I mean, that's been his keyword: stability, harmony, those kind of things.
Well, listen, gents, thank you for coming. It's been very nice to have you.
We're now going to be attacked by the gentleman who didn't recognize.